Jeff Davis, KE9V, is going to be speaking to us for a few minutes here today on a topic called solar minimal. And we'll turn the meeting over to him and hear what he has to say to us about it, Jeff. And I appreciate you taking time and preparing to speak to us here this afternoon.
That's
so
no problem. It's my pleasure.
The meeting's yours, Jeff. Take it away.
So, the band conditions are bad, and everybody wants good news, and there's just not a lot of it to be found these days. We're all familiar with the 11-year solar cycle. It's been observed for centuries, and it's amazing how close to 11 years the sun has been cycling through this change that it makes from one cycle to the next. In fact, if you look at that data and plot it out over the 400 years that we have data for, it's really pretty close. I mean, it's very accurate for something that's a piece of nature that does what it does. But in any event, it affects radio communications, as we all know, because the sun has the ability to charge the upper atmosphere. And when it's charged, frequencies at 14 megahertz and higher really seem to like that. And we're able to bounce signals off the ionosphere when that happens. Now, that's part of the reason why, for instance, 80 meters at the other end of the spectrum, or 160 meters, doesn't do so well in the daytime because those charged particles tend to absorb at those frequencies, and so you don't go anywhere. There's a lot of NDIS at those frequencies. But at night, those bands get good. But again, the problem for us is, especially as QRPers, 10, 12 meters, 15 meters, 17 meters, and 20 meters to some extent is where it's kind of our bread and butter, so to speak, because with small antennas and small amounts of power, you can work around the world, and we've all done that at one time or another, but it's not happening nearly as much as it used to. As far as where we actually are in this solar cycle, this is cycle 24, since they've been measuring them, and we're moving into cycle 25, and earlier this summer, there were some sunspots observed that had the opposite polarity, which is the signal to people who study such things, that we're really moving to a new cycle. But what happens is when you're at this lull at the bottom, you can be in both cycles at the same time. The full transition hasn't taken place. So we're not in cycle 25, although we've seen a couple of spots, very brief spots for cycle 25. We're still in cycle 24. And latest news from the NOAA says they're guessing that the bottom won't happen until about May of next year. So we still have a ways to traipse through this whole thing, and it's just going to be a tough slog to get there. Conditions probably won't get worse than they are right now, but they're not going to get any better significantly until next summer. And this begins to play on people my age, because how many cycles do I have left? I start thinking about things like that.
Sure.
And but it also plays out on a bigger scale, and that is if we're really locked in some long-term 30 or 40-year period where the sunspot count is going to remain relatively low, and it looks like that could be the case. People who make plans for de-expeditions have to change their plans. They don't want to spend $500,000 to go to some island and not be able to work anybody. Now, what they've done in the last few years is you'll see a lot more activity on 160 meters. You see a lot more Earth, Moon, Earth, the moon bounce guys. You see a lot more of the digital activity, which seems to still be digging out some signals. But the de-expeditions, as they plan these things, especially the real expensive ones, they're paying attention to all this, and it may have an impact that we may see. Something that I think is kind of cool, and I'll pass these around. You can take a look at when you got in the hobby, what cycle we were in when you guys got in the hobby or when I got in the hobby. So take a look at this sheet, and you'll see over on the left is the actual solar cycle. I only went back to cycle 18, which is 1940s. I didn't figure too many of us were here from the 30s. But in any event, on the air in the 30s, in any event, if you look, the first column after the solar cycle number is the date when that cycle started. The minimum number that I have there, that's the minimum average of sunspots. The peak during that cycle is the next one. And then the maximum number of sunspots. And that's a smooth number. They look at sunspot numbers and they have a way to average those and get those numbers. There's also a couple of other interesting things, which is the rise time and the duration. The rise time is the amount of time that it took to get from minimum to maximum. And you'll see, as you go down through here and get closer to where we are today, it's taken longer to get from minimum to maximum, which basically means we're spending more time at lower levels than we are at any higher levels. And that's why we're suffering like we're suffering. You'll also notice out in that far right column the number of spotless days. And that number, especially in this cycle, has been pretty miserable at 817. So you can see where those are. And In that bottom line in cycle 24, because 24 is not over yet, those numbers aren't complete. They'll change a little bit by the time we actually move to cycle 25, and we know what those are. But they're not going to change much. And you can see in the duration column, if you look at the average at the bottom, the average over the last 6 or so solar cycles really has been almost right at 11 years, so 10.8 years. And it just points out that this is the reason why the band conditions are as miserable as they are. The other part of that is when signals are weaker, you're chasing signals that are farther down in the noise. So you notice more noise. You hear people say all the time, "Oh, I just got so much noise at my QTH." Well, so two things are happening. You really do have more noise at your QTH because we keep adding more electronics things, wireless routers, and all kinds of things around where we live. But you don't notice that when somebody's 20 over 9. You really notice it when they're S3 or S4, that suddenly you're listening to a lot of noise and you have this perception that, well, crap, all I hear is noise. It's not all because of the solar conditions, the noise part, but the solar conditions are causing the signals that are normally easily copyable to be harder to copy. So you're listening to a lot more noise, and that's why it feels that way.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, you started here solar cycle 18,
Yep.
and you got a date of 1944 February. What initiated them, you think, to begin with solar cycle 1? Is it just when they started watching it?
Yeah, it
Oh,
was.
okay, that's what I wondered.
Because obviously that way predates radio. Nobody knew it had an effect on radio until they invented radio.
Yeah,
In,
okay.
the turn of the century.
I wondered about that.
Yeah, and the there's a reason for that. We'll get to in a bit why they would even bother to look at it to begin with. There was a lot of belief a long time ago that somehow it had an effect on the weather, or that it could affect other things on Earth. And so there were astronomers 400 years ago who would look at the face of the sun and just literally count the numbers, and they recorded them, so we have that information. Obviously, it's not as good a data as we probably get today from satellites and all that kind of stuff, but it was as accurate as they could get if you go back to that time. There's a couple things. So there's some advantage to being at this part of the solar cycle, one of those being that low band communication usually is enhanced. I've listened to Carl Lutzelschrab, the guy at KE9V, the guy up in Fort Wayne, he's an expert on solar propagation. He says it's actually possible if the solar activity got so low that even 80 meters wouldn't play, but we've not reached near that point, and so I don't think we have any immediate worry about that. The other thing is that's kind of interesting, by having all this data and being able to see what propagation does when we're near the bottom for as long as we have, and with all the new tools that we have for doing that, it's become obvious that 20 meters can still support global communication at 0 sunspots. So 20 is still a player. Problem has been 20 has shifted when it opens and when it closes. Some of us probably remember when 20 was open all day and all night. I remember those days. It's like I could turn on 20 meters anytime and there was DX to be worked. That's not the case anymore. So what that drives, and the problem that causes is, generally when 20 meters is open, if you have a job, you're going to miss it, generally. If you're retired and can shift your time schedule and all that kind of stuff, there's still DX to be had on 20 meters. 15 gets a lot dicier, and 10 meters, put it to you this way, I was at a DX conference a month ago, and the guy who was speaking on this said, if you own any records at 10, 12, 15, or 17 meters, congratulations, you're probably going to own them for a long time because nobody's going to beat you in these kind of conditions on that kind of thing. So it's one thing to think about. But the other problem is now going forward, so cycle 24 is winding down, and this was a pretty weak cycle. You can see on here at cycle 24, our max sunspot count was only 116. And if you look at like 21, 22, and 23, you see that 21, the max sunspot count was pretty high, and then it's just been a downward trend ever since. The belief is that's probably going to continue. So what I'm hearing, people at the NOAA and NASA are saying that cycle 24 is probably going to be a lot like, cycle 25 is going to be a lot like cycle 24 or worse. So there's not a huge uptick coming. But once again, the advantages for us are twofold. One, it's going to be better than it is right now at max. So there is some future, even if it's not as good as it was 35 years ago, it's going to get better. The second thing is when there's less activity on the sun, there's less solar storms. And we're affected by solar storms too. So even in those years and those cycles where you had great solar activity, we were also being shut down from time to time for solar storms because it's more prominent when the sun's very active. So we're not seeing many of those, and in fact, I've got a little more on that here in just a minute, I'll tell you, but it's kind of interesting. So when they're tracking what cycle we're in and how they know we're switching cycles is, the sunspots actually have a polarity, just like a north-south, and the sun flips that polarity with every cycle. And so when they begin seeing the plus minus instead of the minus plus, they know, hey, this is a sunspot from the next cycle. And we've seen a few of those. But like I said, they were very brief this summer. They were about the only 6 sunspots that were observed in the entire summer period. And they went away very quickly. In fact, the Space Weather website would report it, and then people would flood them with emails saying, we're looking at the sun, there's no spots. And they're like, yeah, it lasted like 20 minutes. You missed it. You know, it was that short. So, but they did note that it is, the plus minus thing did flip, which means we really will have a cycle 25. And if you really think about it, it's kind of a miracle that we have it anyway. There's no, 1,000 years ago, no one thought about this kind of stuff for radio because there was no radio. It's kind of amazing that it even works like it works. But the other thing that everything's tempered by is the fact that the sun's billions of years old, and we've been observing 400 years, so who knows, what it'll do tomorrow. We all like to think it's predictable and we know what it is. And it does seem to have certain common things that it does, but anything could happen, so who knows, So this is an opportunity, I think, for us to enhance what we're doing on the low bands. I mean, I think if you don't have an antenna up for 75 or 80 meters, you're probably going to miss out on a lot of activity. And it's just a good time to try to get it if you can. I realize, 160 is great too. In fact, I was listening the other night at 160 and conditions were really good. They were especially good. There's a lot of DX on 160 meters right now, which is kind of early into the winter season for 160 meters. But most people don't have the real estate to put up a 160 meter antenna. And so you're kind of stuck with what you got from that standpoint. So just the typical, I've been getting these, I don't know if anybody subscribes to the daily DX bulletin, but Bernie always writes at the end of every one of them, the daily, 5 days a week, here's the solar conditions for the day, and he must just have a rubber stamp, and he's just stamping these because they just don't ever change anymore. And they sound something like this: the October 10th adjusted solar flux index was 67, there were 0 sunspots, and then he goes on to say how many spotless days there have been in this cycle and so forth. And it's just stayed the same for so long that it's really a doldrum that's kind of boring, and everybody knows that, right? Band conditions just aren't great. But keeping in mind, you can't give up because every now and then things still happen. Things happen for reasons other than solar propagation as well. But this is a great time to explore VHF, UHF, 6 meters. I mean, they're pretty. Those bands are unaffected by what happens on the sun. And if you can get something up on 80 or 160 meters, there's still work that can be done there. It's really the 20, 15, 17, 12, 10 that you're probably not going to see much activity there, like I said, except if you're there at the right time on 20 meters. But there's nothing happening on 10 much anymore. Now, I said all that, but now there's FT8. So now you have a digital mode that can hear below the noise, and we're suddenly realizing that their signals were available there all the time, whether the propagation was or not. We just couldn't hear it, right? So FT8's dug a lot of that stuff out and has made it much more interesting, and that's why everyone's jumped on FT8's bandwagon. As that goes, I've heard lots of FT8 traffic on 10 meters. I mean, middle of the day, there's nothing else on, you don't hear anybody else. And I think that's the magic of why when there's a contest, you suddenly notice band conditions were pretty good for the contest. It's because there's just more people on, there's more signals, you can hear them. People come in, or at least I do, I come in, I turn on the radio if there's nothing on. If it sounds like it's another bad evening, I go watch Gunsmoke, and I'm not listening anymore. But activity still happens. It's not all gone. It's not all completely bleak. It's just going to be a little rougher. So I found an interesting article the other day that talked about the summer here in the Northern Hemisphere for 2019 is probably going to go down in history as the summer without any sunspots. So the article says from June 21st until September 22nd, the sun was blank more than 89% of the time. And this is that during the entire season, only 6 tiny sunspots briefly appeared, often fading so quickly that no one even saw them. So it's kind of a rare period that we're in. It's somewhat rare. I like the idea of, and there's a lot of talk about this now, but maybe the ARRL needs to change it so they have DXCC for cycle 24 and DXCC for cycle 25. And that probably makes sense if you look at this, because if you go back the halcyon days for I think most hams that are what we consider the older hams these days, look in the 50s. Look at the numbers for the 50s and how high those were. And it's interesting, at every DX meeting or convention that I go to, they always do kind of the same thing. They say, anybody that's worked 100 countries, stand up. Well, almost the entire room stands up, right? And then they say, well, if you've worked more than 150 or only up to 150, sit down. A few people sit down. At 200, a few more people sit down. 250, you get to 330 or something like that, and you've got two guys that are 180 years old. And it's because they took advantage of the DX that you can't get today. And they were able to work countries, and some of those countries don't exist anymore. So, there's some of that. But it's really kind of interesting if you watch people that have been around. If they operated in the 50s, they had a pretty good leg up. You might already have 300 confirmed countries from the 50s that are carried forward to today. So it was a different time. It was an interesting period, and what can you do? You can't beat that. One of the other things that's an opportunity now is to be able to experiment with radio in the minimums. There would be nothing wrong with saying, I want to start over on worked all states and get worked all states during the solar minimum. That's kind of cool. It's a tougher thing to do. It's not as easy as it was before. It may be hard, but there's probably things we could learn from operating at the solar minimum. And if this thing is a trend that's going to go on for 2 or 3 cycles in front of us, it's probably good that we figure those things out. And that's probably why Joe Taylor and Fran, whatever the guy's name is, created FT8, was because they they already had that software for moon bounce and things like that. But by putting it on HF, now suddenly there's more activity on HF. And in fact, you'll find on the FT8, you won't ever run out of stations to work on FT8. It's just not fun. It's not the same fun. It's not the same thing. Or at least it isn't to me, but I'm old. So for younger hams, they seem to really have taken to it, and they seem to love it. And again, it's just because if you can go 24 dB below the noise floor and copy signals, well, they're out there. It doesn't matter about solar propagation at that point. They are there, and you can work them. So, it works. One of the things that nobody will say, and there's probably good scientific reason not to say it, but I find it interesting that more hams don't say it. Maybe it's wishful thinking or whistling past the cemetery or whatever you want to call it. But, we had a period of about from 1645 to 1715, where there were no sunspots. And they called it the Maunder minimum because there was an astronomer and his last name was Maunder, and he is the guy who kind of put all this together after the fact by looking at these sunspots. Obviously, there was no radio in those days, so nobody cared. But what if we're in another Maunder minimum is the question that a lot of people will ask, and it'll come up. And that could be 75 years that you go with really bad solar conditions. I don't think we're there. We're not at that level, I don't think, at this point. The other thing is, too, people often link that together because during that same period, it was the Earth's last little ice age. So there's a lot of thought that, does this cool the Earth? What does it do? The fact that there's less solar activity, does that mean the sun's not putting out as much energy? And that doesn't really seem to be the case. The science seems to show that what nobody will tell you is that 10 or 15 years before the sunspots went away, there was several huge volcanoes on the Earth. And they kicked up enough ash and stuff to block the sun. And that's probably what caused the temperature to drop. But it was a significant drop. Crops were lost. People died. I mean, it was a big deal. But somehow that's kind of got linked with the sunspot minimum. And I think people are more concerned about it than they need to be. But keeping in mind, here's just an interesting 75 years where there weren't any sunspots. So, could this be something like that? I guess it could. We hope it doesn't. It probably isn't. And it probably won't freeze the Earth, and we're not all going to die. So I think that's probably all the good news with that.
I wonder how this affects the military.
It has an impact on them. You notice a few years ago, I think they take everything up ahead of time before we do because they stay on point with the whole thing. And you'll notice that about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even a little longer, they started getting real interested in NVIS. If you don't need propagation, if you don't need ionospheric propagation, HF works great. If you really just want to work a guy 75 miles away every day reliably, you can do that, and who cares what the sunspot number is. It's this thing that we all like because we like to get on the air, and the magic is, boom, hey, here's a guy from South Africa, and that's cool, and that's part of the reason all of us got involved with radio. But literally, if you just want reliable communications, you can do that.
Ground wave.
Yeah, and there's ways to enhance that. A lot of NVIS antennas are on the market now, people use it, and it's, especially for nets, like the local Indiana net, where they're just passing traffic in the state of Indiana. That all works and is supported and doesn't require this, any solar propagation at all. But the fun part, I guess, is to get on 15 meters sometime with 3 watts and work somebody halfway around the world. We all like that. We've all done it before, and it's kind of the exciting part of the hobby. That's probably not going to happen a lot in the next few years. So that's kind of the downside and the bottom line. So anyway, just a couple of last bullet points are that, once again, now's a great time. If you ever thought about doing anything at VHF, like contesting or weak signal work or meteor scatter or moon bounce or anything, now's a good time to play with it, because you're not going to be missing a whole lot on the HF bands. Unless you're chasing some specific award or something like that you're wanting to work on, you're not going to miss much, so now's a good time to go do that. I see that as a plus. Better antennas always help. Doesn't make any difference where the solar conditions are, so it's a good time to improve antennas. And one of the other things QRPers have going for us is we do a lot of home brewing and kit building and things like that. So there's a lot to do. I could spend the next year catching up on my QSLing, so I've been bad. But there are other things to do besides just getting on the air every single night that we can do. The low bands are still the low bands. It's nighttime. Of course, you have to have longer antennas, bigger antennas. And better grounding helps a lot, especially at 160.
I have another question. Don't mean to interrupt.
Yep, nope.
But you mentioned something, NVIS antennas.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't know what that was. I looked it up, and evidently it means near vertical incident skywave.
Yep.
Okay. What is it?
So,
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? You
Yeah.
must know more about it.
well, I mean, just from the standpoint of at HF, a lot of people will use an antenna that is, you know how the general wisdom is about dipoles, that you want them like
Is
this,
it
you don't
the
want them
angle
like
of
this.
radiation?
If you can get them angled at a steeper angle like this, the signal tends to just go up and come right back down.
Okay.
And that's the near vertical incidence. So the whole idea is, if I do this and come back down, I come back down over an 80 or 100 mile area, as opposed to trying to actually work some propagation off of the ionosphere.
Okay.
There are antennas available that do that, and there's a lot of designs online.
Primarily, it's directed at the radiation angle.
It is.
To-
It
yeah,
is.
Okay.
Low antennas in that case work better too. A lot of guys will actually put dipoles nearly on the ground. And it's great if you have a buddy 38 miles away and you just want to talk to him every night. It's a perfect setup. You don't have to listen to anything else, and there's not a lot of static and so forth. The other thing is that might get us through this whole thing, as QRPers anyway, I tend to think, and you can tell me I'm wrong, and I might be, but I think we kind of have lowered expectations anyway. Because we're using minimal equipment and minimal power and all that kind of thing, I don't think any of us get into QRP and say, I'm going to be at the top of the honor roll in 1 year. I mean, I think that if you do, your expectations may be a little up twisted. You might want to readjust. I'll tell you this. I hear, even in these bad conditions, every single day, I hear guys in parks using 5 watts or 10 watts with a battery-powered rig, and he's in Iowa. Okay, so it's not rare DX, but I can work him and he can hear me, and we work and we check another one off the list, and I've worked another park. There's a lot to do that doesn't require you to work around the world every time you touch the key, and there's a lot of people to work, especially here in the States. We're fortunate that we have so many people that are operating. So to me, and I don't know if lowered expectation is a good thing to say, because it makes it sound like, well, we don't expect much out of it. But I think the bottom line is, if you're expecting to go from 0 to the top of the honor roll in these conditions with 5 watts, you're probably sadly mistaken, I think, or you're on maybe a fool's errand. But if you just want to work anybody, and QRP still works fine, there's no issue with that. And then, like I said, the other one is, and I'm not a huge advocate, but FT8, it works. It's one of those digital modes that just works. And these guys are just sending little bits of information, and that's their forte, because fading doesn't bother them much. You only need a few seconds to pass 45 seconds to pass the necessary information between the two of you. And you can work a lot of people that way, and a lot of people are on FT8. So you might want to give it a try if you haven't. You'll be amazed. I've been on 6 meters FT8, worked a guy in Cincinnati, and that had to be ground wave. I mean, the band wasn't open. I didn't hear anybody else, but me and that guy were working each other. So it's just one of those things, when you can get 20 dB below the noise or something like that, you can work a lot of stuff. So that's all I have.
A few questions I have, and I can't answer this because I don't remember, and maybe Donnie can. because I don't see enough old people besides us, Bill. Check. Receiver sensitivity, does that help, or does the noise level and the signal both float together? I can't use the right term, maybe. I'm thinking that receiver sensitivity in 1960 wasn't as good as it is today. But does that make a difference when you're trying to separate signal from noise?
I don't think it does. I think
You hear them both probably together.
I think you still do, and I don't know that the sensitivity has gotten all that much better. What's gotten better has been selectivity. You know,
I should have said.
yeah, when guys are off to the side of you and you're in a contest, today's transceivers beat anything you'll ever find. You'd hear everybody at one time on one frequency in the 50s or 60s. But in terms of just pure sensitivity, I think you're right. I think you're hearing the same, roughly the same. I mean, there's a difference if it's an old radio that's been restored. Maybe it hasn't been restored properly or to spec because it's an old spec.
But I guess my question is, does it really matter? If they both float together.
I don't think it does.
You know,
Does the sun rotate?
I think some of the equipment back then amplified more noise, which will eliminate some of the things
Because of
you
the
hear.
noise of tubes, you mean?
Well, that not just tubes, even some of the old transistors, some of these new low noise FETs will not have near the noise figure that some of the old stuff did. So I think in that respect, you're going to hear more than you used to.
Because you're not creating your own noise.
you know,
You're not manufacturing noise in your receiver.
sharper filters today too
Oh yeah.
Gets rid of the desensing effect you used to have. You know, more so
Sides of the skirt.
because the skirts are just, they
Oh
they
yeah.
they're steeper. They go straight up. Used to, your skirts
Right.
on the filters would go like that, and now with digital signal processing, I mean, it's like brick wall. It's just almost straight up.
Yeah, the combination of a crystal roofing filter with
Right.
SDR at the bottom.
Yeah,
is
to kind of get some
about the
initial
best we have. Yeah.
boxed in shaping there, and then do the rest of it with digital signal processing.
I know my first digital filters on that. Well, I've got one of them ICOM 756 Pro 2s, and that filter you can move it around.
Yeah.
And you could sit there and have somebody interfering with you. You can just wipe him clear out.
Well, and another good example of this, you just say you take an older receiver that maybe you just have a typical sideband filter in it, no narrow filter. Okay. A lot of the guys will use an audio filter. Okay. So those definitely help. I've played around with those a lot, and I've used them some over the years, quite a little bit. But if the guy is still so close in to you, you're still going to get some desensing. It won't eliminate that. It'll pull the AGC. You can see it pump.
Audio filter.
And I know Tentec, when they first came out with the little Argosies, they had a 4-pole crystal filter in them. And it didn't do too bad, but they had an upgraded 8-pole filter you could get and put in there. And the bandwidth was just a little bit narrower. And it made a big difference when somebody was just out at the edge, because the pass band was just tightened up in the shape of the skirt, And I think, all these things together has made tremendous improvements in, the ability to be able to dig signals
There's
out.
no doubt they have. I mean,
Yeah.
you're right, they have. It's just that when you look at like Sherwood's engineering site where he compares receiver data, really, if you look at that, it's not for the normal regular ham, right?
Right.
If you're in a DX pileup and there's 400 stations all around you, crammed in around you, then having the ability to be more selective and to narrow things down, those are all advantages. But if you were just out in wide open spaces and there wasn't anybody around you, the difference between signal and noise, I don't think has jumped that much
Yeah.
from 30 years ago or 40 years ago to today. There's
okay.
been other improvements, like you say. There's ways to make it sound better. You can make your ears sound better with audio filters and so
And
forth.
there's things too that just really only show up with test instruments, you know. I mean, measurement. That's the old thing about the stereo audio files, you know.
Right.
Total harmonic distortion. You know, you reach a point on there, you're not going to hear it with the human ear. It only shows up on the
The
instruments.
scope where you see it.
Yeah.
But to your point, though, it's bound to be true that today's receivers should create less noise than,
Well,
than
especially
older
at
ones.
VHF and UHF.
Exactly. So they should, do that, and I assume they do. But
Yeah.
In your research, did you find this correlation where contests typically open the bands up?
yeah, it's because people are just there. It's got to be it, right? I mean, there's no.
Yeah, it's like field day.
Yeah, you're on 20 meters and it's dead. I mean, dead. And 3 o'clock hits and bang,
Yeah.
these C-ops are on there. You can't find an open spot in the band that they operate.
Yeah, I've never seen anything
And
that
at
says.
4 o'clock, it goes dead again.
I know. I've never seen
Everybody says
anything
the
that
band's
says
dead.
heating the ionosphere by everybody on the ground. I don't think that works. But I mean, I noticed the same thing.
It's
It's just the
amazing.
lack of people.
You got the same thing on Wednesday mornings about 9 o'clock when the CWC is
Sure.
that contest
That
comes
contest.
on for about an hour or so there.
I'm talking about
They
the
come out of the
C-ops.
woodwork. Yeah.
But-
then it just shuts off. Just goes. It's just like field day's over with.
It is.
It just goes quiet.
Defining the dead band because of solar minimum, is there any kind of data that shows this cycle or this number of sunspots relates to, I don't know what the measurement would be, but
Well, if you look, it may be where you're going, but if you ever look at those MUF charts, they're the MUF, that's the maximum usable.
look at them all the time.
Yeah, when you look at those, you're kind of seeing some of that, although in a real-time snapshot instead of over cycles. But they change a little, but they haven't changed much lately. If you look, it's always like poor to bad conditions
Yeah.
if you're at 20 and up. So,
But I just wondered, is there a, I still work into Europe and not so much Asia, but all over Europe pretty much regularly.
well, around the
But I only work CW. That makes a little difference, maybe.
around the well, I do too, but around the equinox, I worked the austral path daily. I mean, I was working Australians and New Zealands every day.
Yeah.
But on 40 meters, which is kind of a qualifier for that. I wasn't working them on 15, but on 40
No,
meters,
20
I
and
worked them.
40.
But the reason I was hoping Bill Murray would be here is we had a conversation not long ago about the fact that I never hear anything on 15 anymore, but I work. So I'm gone in the day, and he's like, 11 o'clock every day, I can hear a couple stations on 15. It's like, well, see, it's one of those things where if you're there at the right time, if you're there
Right.
24 hours a day, you will hear something somewhere. But it's not
I'm
what
not
I'm
so
on.
certain that that's relative to propagation, but rather activity. Those guys happen to get on at 11 o'clock.
That could well be, too.
I've always wondered about this too. Anybody that's been a ham that's been relatively active, especially on HF, every once in a great while, there'll be like a solar flare-up, and things go deader than mackerel. You ever notice that for a day or two?
Yeah.
I mean, it sometimes it'll last 2 or 3 days before it kind of lets up. And I wonder what kind of solar flare that was that caused that one that was so much different than the other ones.
Well, again, the sunspots generally are the areas where those are emitted when there's large flare-ups like that. And so when we don't have them, we don't see those as much. But when you do have them, if you think about the Earth's ionosphere, it's all magnetic, right? So there's this magnetic field that moves with the solar wind. The wind can push on it and move it, and that can disrupt communications at HF. The other one is if it moves it hard enough that it just wipes out the band, and that happens sometimes. Even a day or two later, it's still shimmering from the effect, the after effect, of what's normally like 93 kilometers per second solar wind to 800 kilometers per second. I mean, it's a storm. It's a literal solar storm.
And let's not confuse like sunspots with like CMEs. You know?
Yeah, no, that's a good point, too. Yeah, when there's storms on the sun, it affects us, too. But there seem to be fewer storms on the sun when there's less solar activity. So,
Does any of your data or any of this call it prehistoric data, did it have any relationship to solar reversals on Earth?
Not that I know of. I couldn't answer it, Carol. I don't know.
I mean, the North Pole's moving.
Mhm.
We know that. They can measure it. But I just wondered if I don't know how long it takes for it to flop, but it's going to flop someday.
Yeah, the inside molten core of the Earth's spinning, right? So, I mean, there's iron inside the Earth spinning inside it, so it's a big, like a magneto deal that's going on, but I don't know how that's affected by the sun. I'm sure it is affected. It probably
If they
is.
solve some of that.
Yeah, it probably is affected somehow, but I don't know how that is.
Do you
My
think?
experience is the bands are only dead if you're not on there. And when people get on, you don't have, even in these low conditions, or what I guess you define as low, there's still all kinds of activity into Europe and
Yep.
south of the equator, and
Yep. Especially if you're on the lower bands, the gray line is a great source of DX if you follow the gray line, because it just works. I mean, it seems to work. Anytime that it's early morning there and late evening here and that kind of thing, or vice versa, it seems to work really well. And I don't think that's affected or impacted
have
that
any
much.
of you ever worked 80 meters on a solar eclipse?
I don't think so.
I've done it twice, and it is absolutely amazing. Because I assume a lot of people do it. That band will be dead, it's daytime.
Yeah.
And that sun gets covered up and it gets dark outside, and boom, that band just goes nuts.
Opens it up, huh?
Oh,
Well, I mean, it blocks the UV, the UV activity, which absorbs 80 or 3.5 megahertz signals, right? So that would, I mean, it's the same thing as like when the animals and stuff all act like they're going to go to sleep now because it's a solar eclipse, right?
Oh, I mean, I know you could stand out in the yard, and when a solar eclipse happens, when that gets completely blocked, you can just feel the temperature almost immediately drop. I mean, you don't have to. You can feel it. It's real. It's it's amazing.
it's called night,
Yeah, night.
In the day.
Night in the day, during the day.
short time.
Okay.
But anyway, so the bottom line is get on the air.